The battle was going correctly. That was the first thing that was wrong. John had learned to distrust battles that went correctly, the ones where every variable was resolved in sequence, every threat appeared at the expected angle, every tactical decision produced the expected outcome. Real combat had friction. Real combat had the specific disorder of opposing forces, both trying to impose their will on the same space simultaneously. A battle without friction was a battle someone had designed. He was on Reach. That was wrong too. Reach was gone. He knew it was gone. The planet's destruction was not ambiguous. The UNSC had confirmed it, and he had been on the surface during the final hours, and the Covenant's glassing was not the kind of event that left room for doubt. But the landscape was Reach's landscape, the terrain signatures matching what Mjolnir's sensor package had stored from 17 years of operating in this specific gravity, this specific atmosphere, this specific quality of light. The Covenant forces ahead of him were dissolving, not dying, dissolving. Flickering out of coherent form the way holographic projections flickered when the emitter was interrupted, the grunts and jackals and elites losing resolution mid-engagement and then simply ceasing to occupy space. The battle that had been going correctly was ending incorrectly, the enemy disappearing rather than being defeated, and John tracked the dissolution with the attention of someone who had learned that the moment a threat stopped behaving like itself was the moment it became more dangerous. Cortana. Silence. He reached for her presence in the neural interface and found the absence where she should have been, not static, not interruption. Simply the absence of something that had been present for so long that its absence was itself a form of wrongness. He'd felt this before. He knew what it meant and what it didn't mean, and he ran through the technical explanations systematically. Communication blackout, forerunner interference, localized domain effect, simulation architecture that had not included her, because including her would have been a tactical error. Simulation architecture. He stopped moving. The last Covenant soldier dissolved. The landscape held Reach's terrain, the specific gray-green of its highland vegetation at this altitude, the mountains, in the distance, at the correct bearing. Everything present except the battle that had given him a reason to be here. "You noticed faster than projected," said a voice that filled the space the way the domain filled space, not from a direction, from everywhere the air was, the resonance of something that existed in a substrate rather than a location. The projection suggested 43 seconds. You required 19. John turned. There was nothing to turn toward. "The Didact," he said. "I prefer not to use that title," the voice said. "It was given to me by a civilization I helped destroy, but you know no other name for me, so it will serve." A pause. "You are in the domain, John, not a representation of it, the actual substrate." The Covenant's dissolution was the transition point, the moment the simulation architecture replaced the real engagement with its own. You were fighting Covenant, then you were not. "The transition point," John said. "How long?" "Long enough," the Didact said. "The domain does not operate on timescales that translate cleanly to human perception. You have been here for what your nervous system would register as 11 minutes. You have been here for what I would register as considerably longer." John assessed his situation. Mjolnir was present. He could feel the suit's familiar weight, the slight pressure differential of the seal, the heads-up display running its standard feed in the lower portion of his vision. Cortana is absent. Location, Reach, simulated. Enemy, undetermined. Objectives, undetermined. He started walking. "There is nowhere to walk to," the Didact said. "The terrain extends as far as I require it to extend. You will not find an edge." "And I'm not looking for an edge," John said. "What are you looking for?" "Information," John said. "Terrain always has information. You built this from something. Something has details you didn't intend." A pause. "You are exactly what Halsey built," the Didact said. I find that relevant to what comes next. What comes next? John said. A conversation, the Didact said. And, before the conversation, a transition. The domain requires accurate architecture for what I've constructed. The armor complicates the architecture. Another pause. I'm going to ask you to remove it. No, John said. It's not a request, the Didact said. I phrased it as one for courtesy. The domain substrate doesn't recognize Mjolnir's seal protocols. The armor will fail here the same way the Covenant soldiers failed, not because I destroy it, because the architecture simply does not support it. I'm telling you, so you can remove it with dignity, rather than losing it without warning. John felt the suit before the Didact finished the sentence. The seals are going, not catastrophically sequentially, one system at a time, the suit's power distribution failing in the specific pattern of a controlled shutdown rather than damage. The HUD is going dark, the pressure differential releasing, the weight changing as the hydraulic systems lost their assistance and the armor became what it actually was, 250 kilograms of titanium alloy plating that a human body could not carry. He disengaged the manual releases. The suit came apart around him in sections, the way it was designed to come apart for emergency extraction. He let it go. The pieces hit the ground and were there for 3 seconds. Real weight, real sound. The specific impact of Mjolnir's components on Reach's highland terrain, and then they dissolved the same way the Covenant had dissolved. He stood in the simulation in the bodysuit. He was still 2 meters and 12 centimeters tall. The augmentations remained the bones and muscles and nervous system and reaction time that Halsey's program had built from a 6-year-old boy's raw material. Those were not external. Those were him. But he felt the air on his face. He hadn't felt air on his face on a battlefield in a long time. Better, the Didact said. For who? John said. For the architecture, the Didact said, and for the conversation. A pause. And for what I need you to see clearly when it arrives. The landscape changed. Not dramatically. Gradually, the way a set of conditions shifted into another set of conditions, the way weather moved across terrain, the highland grass becomes lower elevation. The mountain bearing changed. The quality of the light warming, the gray-green palette softening into something that had no military application, no tactical significance, no function in any engagement he'd been trained for. Residential. The terrain becomes a neighborhood, and then a street, and then a house at the end of it. Single-story, modest, Eridanus II colonial architecture. The specific style of a colony that had been stable long enough to develop aesthetic preferences. A garden that someone had maintained with care. He knew the garden. He'd pulled the weeds in it when he was 5. John stopped walking. No, he said. Not to the Didact. To the house. The front door opened. His mother stepped out. She looked the way she looked in the memory. That was the first thing he checked, the specific function of a mind trained to verify, to compare observations against stored data, to identify discrepancy. The memory was 30 years old and had been accessed infrequently and was not high resolution by the standards of his normal recall. Hair red-brown, the specific shade that caught light differently depending on angle, medium height. The way she stood in doorways, weight slightly on the left foot, a habit she'd had so long it was posture. The simulation had the weight distribution right. That was more detailed than Halsey's files should have contained. Oni's conscription records documented physical description, medical history, genetic markers. They did not document how a woman stood in her own doorway. The domain had other sources. He filed this and stayed where he was. John, she said. His name in her voice. Not Spartan, 117, not Chief, not the various tactical designations that had accumulated across 30 years of service. 4 letters that had belonged to a 6-year-old boy and had been in storage since Halsey's team took him from this street in the early morning hours of a day, he remembered, in fragments. He did not move toward her. You're not her, he said. She looked at him with an expression that the memory didn't contain. The memory had warmth, general warmth, the ambient emotional register of early childhood, before the capacity for detailed psychological reading was fully developed. This expression was specific. It was the expression of a woman who had been told something difficult and had decided how to hold it. "Come inside," she said. "Your father is home." The house's interior matched. He catalogued it as he entered, the trained observation running below the level of the experience itself, the kitchen to the left, the sitting room ahead, the hallway to the bedrooms. The specific smell of the house, which the Didact had reconstructed from something, from John's own neural architecture presumably. The olfactory memory, the most persistent of the childhood data, because smell encoded differently than visual memory and lasted longer. It smelled like a house. He hadn't known he still had that until it hit him in the doorway, and the years between 6 and 37 collapsed into something that didn't have a tactical category. He kept moving. The sitting room had furniture that matched the period and the colony's economic bracket. Nothing remarkable. The comfortable accumulation of a family that was stable without being affluent. His father was in the chair by the window. Thomas. Larger in the memory than in actuality, the way all childhood remembered adults were large, John had been scaling against a 6-year-old's reference frame. The man in the chair was average height, broad in the shoulders, the physical type that John's own frame had been derived from and then systematically exceeded. He had a reader in his lap. He looked up when John entered. He looked at his son. The son, who was 2 meters and 12 centimeters and had the bone density of a creature designed for violence and the muscle mass of something that didn't exist in nature and hands that had killed things with or without weapons for 30 years. The man looked at all of this, and his expression was not fear. It was grief. "Sit down," Thomas said. "I'll stand," John said. "Sit down," his father said again. "Not authority request." The specific tone of someone who needed the geometry of the room to be something manageable. John sat. The chair across from his father, the chair he had sat in as a child when his father read to him, when the house was a house, and the life in it was a life, and none of what came after had happened yet. He sat in it now, and it held his weight, and it was real in the way the simulation made things real. And he looked at his father across the distance of 30 years, and a war, and a program that had taken a boy from this room and built something else in the boy's place. "How long have you been here?" John said. "Since you left," his father said. "That's not an answer," John said. "It's the only one I have," Thomas said. "We've been here since you left, the same way we were here before you left." He set the reader aside. "You look like me." "I know," John said. "More than you should," his father said. "Whatever they did to you, you should look like something else entirely. But you look like me." He paused. "I checked. In the early years, I looked at the UNSC recruitment posters, the ceremonial footage they released, looking for, I knew they took a boy from this street. I knew which boy. I looked for 30 years. Did you find me?" John said. "No," his father said. "They're careful about that." John looked at his father's hands, the reader on the armrest. The specific quality of a man who had been sitting in this chair for 30 years with a grief that had no resolution and had learned to carry it the way people learned to carry the things that didn't go away. The simulation had built this from something. He needed to keep remembering that. "This is a trap," John said. Not to his father, to the room, to the Didact's architecture around him. "Yes," his mother said from the doorway. He looked at her. "I know it's a trap," she said. "I know what I am." She came into the room and sat in the chair that had been hers, the specific chair, the one by the lamp. "It doesn't change what happened. What happened is real, even if we aren't." "What happened?" John said. "You were taken," she said. "I was conscripted," John said, "for a program that—" "You were 6 years old," she said. "In the night. They replaced you with a flash clone that died within the year." Her voice was even. Not accusatory. Worse than accusatory. Factual. We buried a child that wasn't our child. We mourned a death that wasn't a death. Our son was alive somewhere, being made into something we didn't consent to, and we buried a stranger and called it John. John said nothing. He knew all of this. He had known all of this for a long time. Halsey's files eventually declassified to him the specific mechanics of how the SPARTAN-II conscription had been managed, the flash clones, the deliberate bereavement of families who otherwise might have searched, might have found, might have disrupted the program. He had processed it. He had filed it. He had continued operating. "What do you want me to say?" he said. "Nothing," his mother said. "We don't want you to say anything." She looked at him with the expression from the doorway, the one that held something difficult. "We want you to sit in this room and understand that this is where you were, before everything else. This room and this street and us." She paused. "Whatever you are now, whatever they made, you were here first." The house held the statement. John looked at the room, at the furniture that matched, at the smell that the domain had pulled from the deepest part of his neural architecture, at the light through the windows that was Eridanus II's light, the specific quality of a G-type star at this orbital distance, the light he'd run in as a child before he'd understood what running was for. He had been here first. He had been a boy in this room before he'd been anything else. The Didact had built the trap correctly. He stayed for 2 hours. Later, he would assess this as an error. The correct response to a known simulation was extraction, immediate and methodical, not engagement with its architecture. But the correct response required a clear understanding of the extraction method, and he didn't have one yet. So he told himself he was gathering information, and he sat in his childhood home and talked to his parents. His mother made food. He didn't eat it. The simulation's physicality was convincing, but there were limits to what he was willing to accept, and consuming food in a Forerunner construct was further than he'd go. But she made it anyway, and the smell was in the room, and he sat at the table that had been his family's table and watched his parents across it. They talked about ordinary things first. His father's work, the colonial infrastructure projects, the specific problems of Eridanus II's second-generation development, the ordinary concerns of a man whose life had continued on the track it was on, his mother's garden, the street, the neighbors, the accumulated detail of 30 years of a life in a place. Then less ordinary things. "Do you remember the creek?" his father said. "Yes," John said. "You used to go every morning before school," his father said. "Even in winter, we couldn't keep you inside." He looked at his hands. The boy they left us, the clone, he didn't like the water. He was afraid of it. That was the first thing that was wrong. John looked at his father. "He died afraid of water," Thomas said, "and we buried him as our son. And I've thought about that for 30 years. He met John's eyes. What you were afraid of. Whether they trained it out of you. Whether you're afraid of anything." "Yes," John said. "What?" his father said. John thought about what he was afraid of. He was afraid of being the last one. He had watched Spartans die, and civilians die, and entire civilizations come close to dying, and the specific fear that had survived all of it was the fear of standing at the end with nothing left to protect and no mission to run. The fear that the thing he'd been built to do would be finished and there would be nothing underneath the function. He didn't say this. "Losing," he said. His father nodded slowly. "That's mine too," he said. The simulation was doing something John hadn't anticipated. Not the horror register he'd been monitoring for, not the overt wrongness of things turning bad, the direct threat that his tactical processing would engage. Something quieter. The specific weight of sitting in a room with people who had lost him and continuing to lose him across a 30-year distance that neither party had chosen. He was being asked to feel the gap, not to fill it, not to resolve it, to feel its actual dimensions. He understood now why the armor had to go. The armor managed distance. It was the gap made physical 250 kilograms of titanium between John and everything that wasn't the mission. Without it, he was sitting at a table with his parents, and the gap was the actual size of the gap, which was considerable. The Didact had built this correctly. He needed to find the flaw. He looked at his mother. "There's someone else here," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd been tracking the simulation's architecture for 2 hours, and there was a presence in it that his parents didn't account for a third variable. Something the Didact had added that wasn't drawn from Halsey's files, or Onai's records, or his own neural architecture. His mother looked at the hallway. "He arrived after you did," she said. "He's been waiting." "Who?" John said. His mother looked at him with the expression he'd been reading for 2 hours, the one that held something difficult. "Your brother," she said. John looked at the hallway. A man stood in it. 2 meters. John's build, John's frame, the specific bone structure that Thomas's genetics produced in the male line. The face was close enough to John's own face that the recognition was immediate and visceral and wrong. Not a clone, not a copy. The individual variations of a separate life lived in the same genetic material. Older than John should have looked. Marked differently, the marks of a civilian life rather than a military one. The weathering of a man who had worked outdoors, who had worried, who had lived in one place long enough for the place to leave its record on him. He was looking at John with an expression that was not grief. It was 30 years of a specific, focused anger. "John," the man said. His voice was John's voice, at a different register, the same vocal architecture, shaped by different air and different years. "I don't have a brother," John said. "You don't know that," the man said. "You left when you were 6. The man in the hallway moved into the room the way people moved in rooms they knew well, without looking at the furniture, the body's memory of the space doing the navigation. He sat in the chair against the wall, the one that hadn't been anyone's specific chair in John's memory, the chair that guests used. John watched him. 2 meters. The frame was right. Thomas's frame scaled up, the same shoulder width, the same proportion of limb to torso. The Didact had used John's own genetic architecture as the template and built backward from it, constructing what the male line produced when the UNSC didn't get to it first. The face was the most unsettling element. Not John's face close enough to John's face that the gap between them was readable as years and choices rather than different parentage. The same raw material, different hands. "You were born after I left," John said. 2 years after, the man said. "My name is David." He said it the way people said things they expected to be challenged on. "They told me about you when I was old enough to understand what telling me meant. What happened to you? What they did." "What did they tell you?" John said. "That a woman from the UNSC came in the night and took their son and left something in his place that died," David said. "That they had a son somewhere who was alive. That the UNSC had him and was doing things to him that nobody outside the program was allowed to know." He paused. "They told me when I was 8. I spent the next 20 years trying to find you." "You didn't find me," John said. "No," David said. "Oni is good at what it does." He looked at John with the 30-year anger that had been in his expression from the doorway. Not hot anger, the cold, organized kind, the kind that had been maintained over a long time and had become structural. "I found your name eventually. Master Chief Petty Officer, John 117. The Spartan program. What they did to the children they took." He paused. "What they did to you, specifically." John said nothing. "The augmentations," David said. "The ones that killed most of the other children they took. The bones, the eyes, the nervous system." He was watching John's face. "I read the files when they were partially declassified. I read what the failure rate was. I read what they put you through." His voice was level. "And then I read the success rate. What the ones who survived became. What you became. And, John said, and I don't know whether to be glad you survived it, or, he stopped, started again. I don't know what you are, he said. I've been looking at you for 30 years, through files and footage, and I don't know what you are. You look like my father. You move, like something that isn't human. I don't know which of those is true. Both? John said. David looked at him. Both? John said again. That's the answer to the question you're actually asking. I'm Thomas's son, and I'm what Halsey built, and those aren't contradictions. They're both true simultaneously. That's a very clean answer, David said. It's the accurate one, John said. It's the answer a soldier gives, David said. Organized, efficient, no waste. He leaned forward. And, do you know what it's like to grow up the sibling of a ghost? To be the child your parents had after they lost the first one? To watch your mother look at UNSC recruitment footage for 30 years, looking for a face that matched? He paused. They never stopped looking for you. They had me, and they loved me, and they never stopped looking for you. John looked at his mother. She was looking at her hands. I know, John said. You don't know, David said. You weren't here. You were somewhere being turned into something, and we were here being the family that was left. His voice was still level, still organized. I'm not angry at you. I want to be clear about that. You were 6 years old. You didn't choose any of it. He paused. I'm angry at what was done to you. What was done to all of us. I'm angry that the UNSC needed a weapon badly enough to take a child to build it. The weapon was necessary, John said. David looked at him. The covenant, John said. The flood. The forerunner constructs that would have destroyed everything that existed. The weapon was necessary because the alternatives were extinction. He said it without heat. I don't ask you to be glad about what the program did. I'm telling you the context. The context, David said. Yes. The context is that they needed a weapon, and they found a 6-year-old boy, and they decided the weapon was more important than the boy, David said. And you're defending that. I'm providing context, John said. You're defending it, David said. Because if you don't defend it, then what was done to you was wrong. And if it was wrong, he stopped. If it was wrong, then the last 30 years were a crime committed against a child who didn't consent, and everything built from that crime is built on the wrong foundation. He met John's eyes. Can you say that? Can you say out loud that what Halsey did was wrong? John said nothing. The room held the silence. It was a good question. He had thought about it before in the spaces between engagements, in the rare hours of stillness that the war occasionally produced. He had thought about Halsey's files, the full record, the flash clones, and the selection criteria, and the augmentation mortality rate, and the institutional decision that certain children were more valuable as weapons than as people. He had thought about it and reached a position, and the position was complicated, and he had filed it and continued operating. The simulation was asking him to unfold it. What was done to me was wrong in method, he said carefully. The conscription, the replacement, the concealment from my family, wrong. He paused. What was built from it has saved billions of lives. Those facts exist simultaneously. And the child, David said. The 6-year-old. What was done to him? Wrong, John said. Say the whole thing, David said. What was done to me was wrong, John said. The room was very quiet. His mother looked up from her hands. His father looked at him from the chair by the window. David looked at him with the 30-year anger at a slightly different angle, not dissolved, recalibrated. The expression of someone who had wanted something confirmed for a long time and had just heard the confirmation. Thank you, David said. It doesn't change anything, John said. No, David said. It doesn't. But I wanted to hear you say it. He paused. I wanted to know you knew. The shift happened at the 3-hour mark. Not dramatically, the way weather shifted, the pressure differential changing before any visible sign, the trained senses reading the change before the conscious mind named it. John had been monitoring the simulation's architecture continuously. The tactical processor, running below the conversation's surface, looking for the flaw that would tell him how the construct was held together and where it could be taken apart. At 3 hours, something in the architecture changed frequency. The warmth of the room, the ambient emotional register that the simulation had maintained since he'd entered the house, dropped a fraction. Not disappearing, cooling. The specific drop of a room where someone had left a door open somewhere that the people inside couldn't see. He noted it and said nothing. His mother had been talking about the garden, the specific plants, the maintenance cycles, the way Eridanus II's growing season worked. Ordinary, the kind of conversation that lives had in them. The texture of daily existence that the war had removed from John's life so completely that he'd forgotten ordinary conversations had this quality of being about nothing and therefore everything. She stopped mid-sentence. Not naturally mid-thought, the way a feed cut rather than the way a person paused. She sat in her chair, and the sentence she'd been saying was simply absent from the room. Then she said, "You left us." John looked at her. Not the voice from before, the same voice, his mother's voice, the specific timbre the domain had reconstructed from his neural architecture, but the cadence different. The thing that was wrong about Lambert when the Didact's contamination had moved through him in the other story was not available as a reference here. This was different, cleaner. The shift was in the content rather than the delivery. The same woman saying something a different part of the architecture had written. "You left us," she said again. "You had a choice, and you left." "I was 6 years old," John said. "Later," she said. "After the war, after the covenant, after the flood, you had opportunities to come back, to find us, I-land. However, to choose something other than the next mission." Her voice was even. "You never came. I didn't know." "You knew," David said. John looked at him. "The files were declassified," David said. "Partially. Enough. Halsey's records, the conscription lists, your own name in them." He paused. "You had access to that information for years before we did. You knew what you came from. You knew there was a family on Eridanus II that had buried a clone and was still alive." He paused. "You never came. The mission was always there," David said. "There is always a mission. The covenant and the flood and the forerunner constructs, and the next threat and the threat after that. There is always something that needs the weapon." His voice was still level. "You used the mission. You used it because coming back here was harder than the next engagement, and the weapon didn't have a protocol for sitting in this room." John was quiet. The architecture had shifted fully now. The warmth of the room gone, the ambient register cold, the simulation moving from the phase it had been built to deliver and into the phase it had been built for. The accusation phase, the turn from grief to something that had an edge. He'd been waiting for it. He'd still felt the warmth while it lasted. "The Didact is running this," John said. "Not to his family, to the room." "Yes," the Didact said. "Not from everywhere this time, from a specific point, the corner of the room near the window, the place where the light was flattest, a presence without a form, the domain's architecture given a location without a body." "The warmth was real," the Didact said. "I want to be precise about that. What you felt in the first 3 hours was not fabricated. The domain reconstructed your family from every available source, and what they feel about you is what they would feel. The accusation is also real. Both are true simultaneously." 2. A pause. "You just said something similar about your own situation, both things being true simultaneously." "What do you want?" John said. "To show you something," the Didact said. "That's all I've ever wanted in this room. To show you what was taken from you, and what the taking cost, and what you chose to do with those costs afterward." Another pause. "The weapon doesn't have a protocol for this room. You said it yourself. I want to know what the man has." "I'm not going to give you a philosophical crisis," John said, "if that's the objective." "The objective is more specific than that," the Didact said. "I want to know if you can answer your brother's question." John looked at David. David was looking at him with the 30-year anger, and underneath it, something that wasn't anger. The thing underneath anger, when the anger had been maintained for a long time and was tired and wanted to put something down. "Why didn't you come back?" David said. Not as accusation, as the actual question. John looked at his brother, at the man built from his own genetic material and 30 years of a life he hadn't had, sitting in the chair against the wall in the house where they'd both been made from the same source material and only one of them had stayed. He didn't have a clean answer. He had the mission answer and the tactical answer and the institutional answer, and none of them were wrong and none of them were the actual answer to the question David was asking. The actual answer was harder. "I didn't know how," he said. The answer stayed in the room. John let it stay. He didn't qualify it or follow it with the institutional context or reach for the tactical framing that would have made it manageable. He'd said the actual thing, and the actual thing was in the room now, and retreating from it would be its own kind of information. David looked at him. "You didn't know how," he said. "No," John said. "The galaxy's most effective combat operator," David said. Not mockingly, the flat register of someone reading a fact back. 30 years of engagements against enemies that destroyed civilizations, and coming back to a house on Eridanus II was the thing you didn't have a protocol for. "Yes," John said. David was quiet for a moment. "I believe you," he said. John looked at him. "I've thought about this for 30 years, David said. "What I'd say to you if I found you, what you'd say. What the reason would be." He looked at his hands, Thomas's hands, John's hands, the family's hands, in the family's specific shape. "I always assumed it would be the mission. The UNSC has him, that's the reason. The institution keeps him moving, and he never stops long enough to find us." He paused. "That would have been easier to be angry at." "I know," John said. "You chose not to find us," David said. "That's what you're telling me. Not that you couldn't, that you didn't, because you didn't know how to be the person who came back." He looked up. "What does that mean? What does it mean that you didn't know how?" John thought about how to answer this accurately. "After a certain point," he said slowly, "the program isn't something that's being done to you. It becomes what you are. The mission, the objectives, the institutional framework, they stop being external and start being the structure you think inside of." He paused. Coming back here would have required thinking outside that structure, being someone who had a family and a history and a life that preceded the program. He paused again. "I didn't know how to be that person. I'm not sure I knew the person existed." "He existed," his mother said. John looked at her. She was looking at him with the expression that had been in her face since the doorway, the one that held something difficult. But the difficult thing had shifted. The grief was still there. Underneath it now was something else, the specific expression of a woman who had been waiting to say something for 30 years and had found the moment. "The boy who pulled weeds in the garden every morning," she said. "The one who was afraid of the dark until he was 5, and then decided he wasn't afraid of it anymore and went into every dark room in the house to prove it." She paused. "The one who cried when the neighbor's dog died and didn't want anyone to see him cry and went to the creek so he could cry where nobody was looking." She met his eyes. That person existed. He still exists. Whatever they built on top of him, he's still in there. "How would you know?" John said. "Because you said you didn't know how to come back," she said. "The weapon Halsey built wouldn't have said that. The weapon would have given me the mission answer, the tactical answer, the reason that makes it clean and functional and moves the conversation forward." She paused. "You gave me the true answer instead. That's John. That's still John." The room was very quiet. John sat with this. The Didact was still in the corner, the presence without form, the domain's architecture holding its position, not intervening. Waiting. The simulation running at the temperature it had dropped to, the warmth gone but not replaced by anything hostile yet. Something between the two phases, the grief phase and whatever came next. He needed to think about the flaw. He needed to keep thinking about the flaw. But his mother had just told him something he hadn't known he needed to hear, and the tactical processor was having difficulty running in its normal register because the frequency the simulation was operating at was not a frequency the processor had been designed for. The Didact is listening to all of this, John said. Yes, the Didact said from the corner. And the point of this phase, John said, was to establish that the person underneath the program exists, that there's a John underneath the Master Chief. He looked at the corner. Because you can't make the argument you want to make if there's no John to make it to. Correct, the Didact said. What's the argument? John said. You already know the argument, the Didact said. You've known it since the house appeared. You've been defending against it since you sat down at the table. A pause. I'm not going to make the argument yet. Your brother is going to make it first, because he's been building it for 30 years and he's earned the right to deliver it. John looked at David. David was looking at the floor, the posture of someone organizing something, not the physical organization of the body, but the interior arrangement of a long-held position being assembled for delivery. He looked up. The Covenant War is over, he said. The flood is contained. The Forerunner constructs, most of them are neutralized or dormant. He paused. The specific existential threats that required the Spartan program have been addressed, not eliminated, addressed. Managed to the point where the argument that the program was necessary to prevent extinction is a historical argument now, rather than a current one. He met John's eyes. So the question becomes what the program is for now, what you are for now. There are still threats, John said. There are always threats, David said. There will always be threats. The UNSC will always have a reason why the weapon is still necessary. He paused. I'm not arguing the program was wrong because the threats weren't real. The threats were real. I'm arguing that the threats being real doesn't answer the question of what you do now that the acute phase is over. The acute phase isn't over, John said. It's less acute, David said. Meaningfully less. And it will continue to become less acute over time because the threats are being managed and the institutions are stabilizing and the galaxy is slowly, imperfectly becoming something that doesn't require a weapon of your specific type to survive every given year. He paused. Which means, at some point, the argument that you have to keep being the weapon because the alternative is extinction stops being true. He looked at John steadily. What do you do then? I don't know, John said. I do, David said. John looked at him. You keep being the weapon, David said, because it's the only thing you know how to be. Because the structure you think inside of doesn't have a category for stopping. Because the UNSC will always find a reason the mission continues, and you will always accept the reason because accepting it is easier than the alternative. He paused. And the alternative is sitting in this room. Being John, not knowing how, learning how. Anyway, John said nothing. You said you didn't know how to come back, David said. That's the thing I've been building toward for 30 years. Not the accusation I told you. I'm not angry at you. The question underneath it. He leaned forward. If you don't know how now, after everything, after 30 years, and the wars, and the losses, when are you going to learn? What has to happen before you give yourself permission to learn? The Didact spoke from the corner. I want to add something to your brother's question, it said. John looked at the corner. Go ahead. I was a weapon, the Didact said. Not as a child I chose it, which is a different thing, but the mechanism is comparable. I was built by a civilization that needed something built, that poured everything I was into the construction of a capability, and the capability was used, and then the civilization was gone, and I remained. A pause. I have had considerably longer than 30 years to think about what comes after the weapon is done with its function. What did you decide? John said. I decided badly, the Didact said. The composers, the Prometheans. The choices I made after the Forerunner civilization fell were the choices of something that had been a weapon for so long that it had no other mode of operation. When the threat that required the weapon was gone, I manufactured a new threat. A pause. Because the alternative was the question your brother is asking. What are you for when what you were built for is finished? You're telling me this as a warning, John said. I'm telling you this as data, the Didact said. I am the case study for what happens when the weapon doesn't answer the question. You can evaluate its relevance. John looked at the corner where the Didact's presence held its position in the flat light. A Forerunner military commander, 10,000 years into an existence it hadn't chosen, having made every wrong decision available to something that couldn't stop being what it was built to be. Offering the trajectory as information, he filed it. The flaw, John said. In the simulation's architecture, I've been looking for it. He looked at his family, his mother in her chair, his father by the window, David across the room. The flaw is that the domain built my family from everything it had access to. Halsey's files, Oni records, my own neural architecture, 30 years of Didact's observation. He paused. It built them correctly. That's not the flaw. No, the Didact said. It isn't. The flaw is the brother, John said. David doesn't exist. The domain couldn't build him from records because there are no records. He was built from my own genetic material and the Didact's understanding of what the male line produced. He's a projection. He looked at David. Not my brother. What my brother would have been. David looked at him. Does that change anything I've said? He said. John thought about this carefully. No, he said. Then what does it matter? David said. It matters because you're the Didact's argument given a face, John said. Everything you've said, the unlived life. The question of what I do after the weapon is done, that's the Didact's position, delivered through someone I couldn't dismiss as easily as a Forerunner construct. He looked at David steadily. It's a good tactic. The argument is harder to defend against when it comes from someone who looks like me. Is it wrong? David said. The argument. John looked at him. At the face that was his face, marked differently, at the 30 years of civilian life in the weathering around the eyes, at the hands that had done work that wasn't violence and had the record of that work in them. No, John said. It's not wrong. Then what are you going to do with it? David said. The simulation's architecture shifted again. Not the temperature drop from before, something more fundamental. The structure of the construct changing at a level below the surface detail. The house's walls are holding, but the quality of the space inside them altering. The warmth and the cold, both absent now, and something else in their place. John recognized it. The approach of the phase the Didact had been building toward since the Covenant soldiers dissolved on Reach. The conversation had been the first weapon. The warmth had been the setup. The accusation and the question, and the brother who looked like him had been the second weapon. The third weapon was about to arrive. He didn't know its shape yet. He looked at his father. Thomas had been quiet for a long time, since the conversation shifted to David's question. The old man had been in his chair by the window, watching his two sons talk, with the expression of someone watching something that was costing them to watch. He met John's eyes. Whatever comes next, Thomas said quietly, I need you to know something first. What? John said. I'm proud of you, his father said. Everything you've done, everything you've carried. His voice was steady. I know you didn't choose it. I know what it cost. I know what we lost and what you lost and how none of it was right. He paused. I'm still proud of you. That's not a contradiction. John looked at his father, at the man whose frame he'd been built from and whose face he still carried underneath everything Halsey's program had added, at the grief in the man's expression and the pride underneath it, and the 30 years of both running simultaneously. Both things being true at once. He'd said that himself an hour ago. "I know," John said. Thomas nodded. Outside the house's windows, the light changed. Eridanus II's warm G-type light going flat. The sky's color shifted toward something that wasn't in the colony's natural spectrum. The cold blue of Forerunner architecture, bleeding through the simulation's surface layer. The domain's true substrate, showing underneath the house and the street and the garden. The third weapon arrived. John stood up. The house didn't disappear. That was the specific quality of the Didact's construction. It didn't replace the simulation. It contaminated it. The walls stayed where they were. The furniture stayed. The garden outside the window was still the garden. The plants his mother had described still in their beds. The specific layout he'd memorized at 5 years old still accurate. But the light coming through the windows was wrong. The cold blue of the domain's substrate bled through the glass and mixed with Eridanus II's warm spectrum, and the combination produced something that existed in neither register, the specific wrongness of two incompatible frequencies occupying the same space. The shadow angles changed. The room's depth changed. The corners acquired a quality that corners in residential homes didn't have. His mother was looking at her hands again. His father was very still in his chair. David was standing. John tracked David first, the threat assessment automatic, the body's priority hierarchy, running below the level of the conversation they'd just had. Upright, weight forward, the specific shift of center of gravity that preceded physical action, not the posture of someone who had decided to act, the posture of someone whose body was being organized toward action by something other than their decision. "David," John said. David looked at him. The 30-year anger was still in his face. But the focused quality was gone, replaced by something unfocused, the expression of someone receiving a signal they didn't have full control over. His hands were at his sides. His hands were wrong. The civilian weathering John had read in them an hour ago. The record of work that wasn't violence was still there. But the hands were positioned differently. The weight distribution in the fingers, the tension in the forearms, combat positioning, built from John's own genetic architecture. The Didact had said, a family of shadows fueled by your own genetic potential. "I don't want to do this," David said. "I know," John said. "It's using me," David said. The unfocused quality in his expression, sharpening for a moment, the man underneath the signal, present, aware, not in control. The same way the installation used Eridan, the same mechanics. "I can feel it running through me, and I can't." He stopped. "I can't stop it. I'm not going to hurt you," John said. "You may not have a choice," David said. The domain's frequency increased, the cold blue in the windows brightening, the corners deepening, the house's walls showing the geometric patterns of Forerunner architecture bleeding through the plaster, the way the chamber's script had bled through the stone of Kaer Morhen in another story, another universe. The same infrastructure doing its work in every construct it built. David moved. He was fast. John had been expecting fast. The genetic architecture was his own. The augmentations the simulation had given David were derived from the same source material, and fast was the baseline. What he hadn't fully accounted for was the specific quality of fighting something that moved like him. Every Covenant soldier, every flood form, every Promethean construct had moved differently from John. Different biomechanics, different reach, different timing. The combat processor had always had a distinct profile to work against. David moved like John moved. The first exchange took 4 seconds and produced no decisive result. David's strike angles were John's strike angles, the same trained prediction of where a target would be, the same reach calculation, John redirected rather than blocked, the Witcher principle applied unconsciously. When the blade won't work, find what will. He put distance between them and assessed. David recovered in the time John would have recovered. "You trained," John said. "You're surprised," David said. The signal running him had settled the man's awareness still present behind it, processing, reporting, but the body executing something else's choreography. "I spent 30 years looking for you. I didn't know what I'd find. I prepared for contingencies." "Who trained you?" John said. "Oni," David said. "Eventually, when the files became accessible, they found me looking through them. They offered something. Information about you in exchange for cooperation." His body was positioning for the next sequence, the same way John's body was positioning, the mirror quality of the engagement, running both directions. "They wanted to know if I'd try to contact you. They wanted me where they could watch me." "Did they know the Didact was building this?" John said. "No," David said. "Nobody knew. It happened too fast." He looked at John with the man's eyes running behind the signal's control. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," John said. "This is the Didact's construct, not you." David attacked. The sequence was 3 moves high, low, redirect, and John recognized it because it was his own sequence, the one Mendez had drilled into the Spartan candidates in the early training years, the one John had used in more engagements than he could count. David had it from the Oni training program, which had derived it from Spartan combat doctrine, which had been built partly on John's own performance data. He was fighting himself. Not a copy himself 30 years younger, without the augmentation's full development, with the civilian life's different conditioning. The same raw material at a different stage of processing. John didn't use the sequence back. He used something older, the unaugmented fighting he'd learned before the formal program, the rough edges that Mendez had refined, and that John had kept underneath the refinement, because rough edges were occasionally the right tool. David's training anticipated Spartan doctrine. It didn't anticipate what John had been before the doctrine. He got behind David's next strike and put him on the floor. David was up in 2 seconds. The signal running him wasn't deterred by being put on the floor. It was assessing, recalibrating, finding the next angle. The man behind the signal was doing the same thing. John could see both processes running in David's expression, the dual occupation of a body by its owner and something else. "The Didact," John said, not stopping his positioning. "What does winning this get you?" "Information," the Didact said from the corner, which was no longer a corner. The domain's architecture had replaced the room's geometry with something older, the walls still present but their angles wrong. The space between them operating by different rules. "I want to know what you do when the target is someone you love, whether the program holds or whether John holds." "Those aren't opposites," John said. "In this room they are." The Didact said, "The program tells you to neutralize the threat. John tells you the threat is your brother. They want different things. I want to see which one you listen to." David came at him again. His mother was still in her chair. John was tracking her in his peripheral vision throughout the engagement, the second threat assessment running parallel to the first, the trained attention that never fully committed to a single axis. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and watching her sons fight in her living room with the expression of someone for whom the watching was its own form of violence. Not the simulation's expression, hers. Whatever the domain had built from Halsey's files and John's neural architecture and 30 years of accumulated data had produced a woman who was watching this with the specific pain of a mother, and the specific pain of a mother was something the domain had apparently learned to simulate correctly. He didn't want her to have to watch this. That was new data. He filed it. His father had moved from the chair, standing now at the room's edge, the same flat expression as his wife, but different underneath. Thomas, watching his sons fight in his living room with the grief of a man who had lost one son to a program and was watching the program's consequences in his living room 30 years later. "Stop," Thomas said. David stopped. Not John. John maintained his position because the signal running David had stopped David's body, but John didn't know if the stop was real or the setup for the next sequence. But David stood still. The signal had responded to Thomas's voice. The domain's architecture had given the father authority in the construct, the specific authority of a parent in a child's nervous system, the register that preceded training and conditioning, and 30 years of a program's architecture. David was breathing hard. The signal was still running. John could see it in the tension of David's posture, the body wanting to continue, the override holding. "Both of you," Thomas said. John lowered his hands. David's posture shifted, not fully released, the signal still present, but responding to the construct's hierarchy. The father's voice, as a system, interrupted. "This is what it does," Thomas said, not to his sons, to the room, to the Didact's presence in its wrong-angled corner. "It takes what we are and puts it against each other. That's all this is. That's all it's ever been." He looked at the domain's geometry bleeding through his walls. "You built this house," from what John remembered. "You built these people from what he carried, and you're using what he loves to break what he is." His voice was steady. "That's not an argument. That's a weapon." "Yes," the Didact said. "I told him from the beginning it was a trap." "Then what are you trying to prove?" Thomas said. "Whether there's anything underneath the weapon," the Didact said. "Whether John 117 exists outside the program's architecture. Whether the 6-year-old boy who lived in this house left anything behind, survived 30 years of institutional formation." A pause. "So far, the answer is yes. But the question isn't finished." "What's the rest of the question?" Thomas said. "Whether what survives is strong enough to matter," the Didact said. "Whether John is a person or a memory of a person. Whether the program left enough that something real is still running underneath it." Another pause. "The combat was data. John didn't neutralize the threat. He restrained instead." End quote. End quote. End quote. The program said, "Eliminate." He chose something else. A pause. "John is still in there. The question now is whether John is strong enough to do what comes next." "What comes next?" John said. The domain's frequency increased again. The house's walls lost another layer of their residential quality, the plaster thinning, the forerunner geometry beneath it more visible. The construct's underlying architecture no longer content to stay beneath the surface. The garden, outside the window, was gone. The street was gone. The neighborhood was gone. The house existed in the domain's substrate, directly now. 4 walls and a floor and a ceiling, and the family inside it, and the cold blue light of the forerunner infrastructure, replacing Eridanus II's warm spectrum entirely. His mother stood up from her chair. She walked to John and stood in front of him and looked up at him, the height differential enormous. The 6-year-old's mother, looking at the 2-meter-12 product of 30 years of augmentation, and put her hand on his face. He went still. Her hand was the right temperature. The domain had gotten that right too, the specific warmth of a parent's hand, the particular pressure, the touch that the neural architecture had stored deeper than any tactical data, because it had been laid down first, before anything else, in the years when the body was still learning what touch was. "John," she said. "I'm here," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I wanted to tell you." She held his eyes. "Whatever comes next, I know you're here. The boy from this house. He's still here." She paused. "Don't let it use that against you." "It already has," John said. "No," she said. "It's tried. There's a difference." She lowered her hand. "Knowing you're here isn't a weakness. It's the thing it can't break. It can use the grief and the guilt and the question about what you do after the weapon is done. It can't use the fact that you exist, that John exists." She stepped back. "That's not a vulnerability. That's the answer." The domain pulsed. Hard, the cold blue light spiking, the construct's architecture registering something, the Didact's presence in the wrong-angled corner shifting. David's body snapped back to the signal's control. His father's voice as interrupt had held for 90 seconds. The domain had recalibrated around it. The authority hierarchy the construct had given Thomas had been a variable, and the Didact had adjusted the variable. David looked at John with a man's eyes and the signal's posture simultaneously. "I can't hold it," David said. "Whatever your mother just said, it's right, but I can't hold the signal off with it. I've been trying since it started." He was breathing carefully, the specific breath of someone managing a physical process they don't fully control. "It's going to run me again." "I know," John said. "What are you going to do?" David said. John looked at his brother, at the face that was his face, marked by 30 years of a life he hadn't lived, at the man the domain had built from his own genetic material, and the Didact's understanding of what the male line produced without Halsey's intervention. At the signal running through someone who hadn't chosen to be here any more than John had chosen to be taken from this house at 6 years old. He looked at his mother, who had told him the answer wasn't a vulnerability. He looked at the domain's cold blue light, replacing Eridanus II's warm spectrum in every window. He looked at the Didact's presence in the wrong-angled corner. "I'm going to answer your question," John said to the Didact, "the one you actually want answered." He paused. Not by fighting David, not by breaking the simulation. By saying it out loud in this room, he paused again. Because that's what the construct has been built for, not combat data. You have 30 years of combat data. You want to know if John is in here? I'm going to tell you. "Tell me," the Didact said. John looked at his family, at the house the domain had built from the deepest available layer of his neural architecture, at the people it had constructed from everything that had been recorded and everything that had been remembered, and the one person it had built from his own unlived life. He looked at all of it. "Yes," he said. "John is here. He has been in here the entire time, underneath the program, underneath the armor, underneath 30 years of institutional formation." He paused. He doesn't know how to come back to this house. He doesn't have a protocol for this room. He's been in there the whole time, and he doesn't know how to use what he is outside the mission's framework. He looked at the corner. That's the answer. That's what survived. A person who exists and doesn't know how to exist. He paused. "Now, tell me what you do with that." The domain was silent. Then the Didact said something John hadn't expected. "I don't know," it said. The silence held longer than domain silences held. John had been in the domain's architecture long enough to read its rhythms. The Didact's presence processed quickly, responded quickly, the military mind's tempo, even in a substrate rather than a body. The pauses between statements were calibrated, not genuine. The Didact used silence, the way tacticians use terrain for effect, for positioning, for the specific pressure of making the other party fill the space. This silence was different. Not calibrated, actual. "You don't know," John said. "No," the Didact said. "You've had 10,000 years," John said. "You've had longer than any human civilization has existed to think about what comes after the weapon is done with its function, and you don't know." "I know what doesn't work," the Didact said. "I provided that as data earlier. The composers, the Prometheans, the manufacture of new threats to justify continued operation." A pause. "I know the wrong answers with considerable precision. The right answer has been less available." Another pause. "I thought perhaps you would have it. A human perspective on the problem. Someone inside the situation rather than 10,000 years past it." "You built a trap to ask me for help," John said. "I built a trap to see if you were still there," the Didact said. "Help is a secondary consideration." A longer pause. "Though yes, if you have an answer I don't have, I would like to hear it." John looked at the wrong-angled corner, at the presence without a body that had been a general and then a weapon, and then a consciousness drifting in a dimensional substrate for 10,000 years, and had made every wrong decision available to something that couldn't stop being what it was built to be. He thought about what the Didact in another universe had said on a castle roof. A directive runs until it completes, or until the system running it is destroyed. The Didact had completed its directive, the Forerunner civilization's defense, the management of the flood, the firing of the Halo array. The system hadn't been destroyed. It had kept running with nothing to run, manufacturing reasons to continue, and every manufactured reason had been worse than the last. You said you decided badly, John said. After the Forerunner civilization fell, the Composers and the Prometheans, you said they were the decisions of something that had been a weapon too long. Yes, the Didact said. What would the right decision have looked like? John said. Stopping, the Didact said. Simply stopping. Entering the domain permanently. Accepting that the function was complete and that continuing to operate without a function was more destructive than not operating. A pause. I couldn't do it. The architecture of what I was wouldn't permit cessation. The weapon without a war finds a war. It paused again. This is not hypothetical. I have watched it happen across multiple iterations of my own decision-making. I am not describing a theory. I am describing what I did. And you couldn't stop it, John said. Not alone, the Didact said. John processed this. That's why you built the trap, he said. Not to break me. Not for the combat data or the philosophical argument. He looked at the corner. You've been alone in the domain for a long time. And alone in the domain, you make the same decisions in the same sequence because there's nothing to introduce a variable. He paused. You built the trap because you needed someone else in the room. The domain's cold blue light held steady, not pulsing, not spiking, holding. Yes, the Didact said. David's posture had changed. The signal running him had dropped, not fully, the tension still in his body, but reduced. The domain's architecture responded to the conversation's shift, the way a system responded when its primary process was interrupted by something the architect hadn't planned for. The Didact hadn't planned to say, I don't know. The Didact hadn't planned this conversation at all. Tell me about the Prometheans, John said. You know about the Prometheans, the Didact said. Tell me what you thought you were doing when you made them, John said. Not the tactical justification, what you thought you were doing. Ask. 8. A long pause. Preserving them, the Didact said. My warriors. The ones who had fought with me across centuries. The flood was consuming everything biological. Every living thing it touched became part of the Gravemind's architecture. I told myself the composition was preservation. That their consciousnesses in the domain were more alive than their bodies consumed by the flood would have been. Another pause. I believed it. At the time, I believed it completely. Did they consent? John said. No, the Didact said. So you preserved them without their consent because you decided their preserved state was preferable to their alternative, John said. You made the decision for them because you believed you knew better. Yes, the Didact said. Halsey believed the same thing, John said. The domain was very quiet. She believed the SPARTAN-II candidates would be better off as Spartans than as civilians on colonies that the Covenant would eventually glass, John said. She believed the program was preservation, that she was saving the children she took by making them into something the war needed. She believed it completely. He paused. I know, because I read her journals. She spent 40 years defending it in her own mind. I want. And was she wrong? The Didact said. Yes, John said. And the children she took saved billions of lives. Both of those things are true. He looked at the corner. The same way your Prometheans were preserved in a form that wasn't what they were, and also served a function that held off the flood for longer than nothing would have. He paused. Neither of you was wrong about the tactical outcome. Both of you were wrong about the right to make the decision. Consent, the Didact said. Consent, John said. That's the variable both of you missed. The outcomes were real. The function was real. The necessity was real. And none of that authorized the decision you made without asking. The domain processed this. John looked at his family. His mother had returned to her chair, not the retreat of someone removing themselves from the situation, but the specific settling of someone who had said what they needed to say and was now present differently. The weight of their contribution delivered. His father was still at the room's edge. David was standing with the signal at reduced intensity, the man behind it more present than the signal now, the unfocused quality in his expression replaced by something that was listening. "The question your brother asked," the Didact said. "What do you do when the weapon is done with its function?" "Yes," John said. "You said you don't know how," the Didact said. "You said the person underneath the program exists and doesn't know how to exist outside the mission's framework." A pause. "That's not an answer. That's a description of the problem." "I know," John said. "Then what is the answer?" the Didact said. John looked at David. At the face built from his own unlived life. At the 30 years of civilian experience in the weathering around the eyes. The specific record of a life that had contained more than the mission. At the man who had organized his 30-year anger into the most precise question John had ever been asked and had waited for the moment to ask it correctly. "I don't have it yet," John said. "I've been in the program since I was 6 years old. The answer to what I am outside the mission's framework is not something I can produce in a house in the domain after 5 hours." He looked at the corner. "But I know it exists. That's new. Before this room, I wasn't certain the question was real." He paused. "Now I know it's real, which means the answer is real, which means it's findable." He paused again. "That's what I have. It's not enough, and it's what I have." "It's more than I have," the Didact said. John looked at the corner. 10,000 years, he said. "And you didn't know the question was real." "I knew the question was real," the Didact said. "I didn't believe the answer existed. I believed the question was the kind of question that had a shape but no content, a space that looked like it should contain something and contained nothing." A pause. "You're telling me the content exists?" "Yes," John said. "How do you know?" the Didact said. John looked at his mother, at the woman built from the deepest available layer of his neural architecture, sitting in her chair in a house the domain had constructed from everything he'd carried for 30 years. At the hand that had touched his face with the right temperature and the right pressure because the body had stored it correctly, deeper than any tactical data, because it had been laid down first. "Because she's still in there," he said. 30 years of a program that was supposed to replace everything that came before it, and she's still in there. The garden, the creek, the dark rooms I went into when I was 5 to prove I wasn't afraid of them." He paused. "If all of that survived the program intact, then the answer survives too. It's in the same place, in the same layer." He looked at the corner. "I just have to learn to reach it." The domain's cold blue light shifted. Not the spike of a pulse or the drop of a destabilization, something different. The frequency changing to a register John hadn't felt in the domain before. Something that wasn't the Didact's tactical architecture or the simulation's emotional engineering or the combat sequences of the earlier phase. Something that might have been the domain itself responding to something it hadn't processed in a long time. "The trap is over," the Didact said. David looked at his hands. The signal was gone fully, the body released, the tension out of his posture entirely. He looked at John with his own eyes and his own expression and his own 30 years of organized anger, and underneath it, now visible without the signal's overlay, something that wasn't anger. Something tired, and something that wanted to put things down. "Is it?" John said. "Not to the Didact, to the room." The trap's purpose was to determine whether John 117 exists. The Didact said, "The determination is made. The trap is complete." A pause. "What happens now is not the trap." "What happens now?" John said. "That," the Didact said, "is the first question you've asked today that I can't answer for you." The house held its wrong-angled geometry. The domain's cold light held steady. David crossed the room and sat back in the chair against the wall, his chair, the guest chair, and looked at John with the expression of a man who had delivered everything he'd been building for 30 years and was now in the unfamiliar space of having nothing left to deliver. "You said you didn't know how to come back," David said. "Yes," John said. "That's a start," David said. "Knowing you don't know how." He paused. "It's not nothing." "No," John said. "It's not nothing," David said again. Outside the house's windows, the domain's substrate pulsed, once the cold blue light brightening for a moment and then settling to a lower level than it had been at any point since Reach dissolved. The architecture running at a register that felt less like a weapon and more like a space, just a space, with people in it. The quiet lasted 11 minutes. John tracked it precisely because precision was available, and available tools got used. 11 minutes of the domain running at its lower register, the cold blue light steady, the house holding its wrong geometry without adding to it. His family in their positions, the Didact's presence in the corner not speaking. He used 11 minutes to think about the exit. The trap was over. The Didact had said so, and he believed it. Not because he trusted the Didact, but because the Didact's stated purpose had been completed, and continuing the trap past its purpose would have been tactically redundant, and the Didact was not tactically redundant. The determination had been made. John 117 existed. The 6-year-old from this house was still running underneath the program. The trap was over. The problem was he was still in the domain. And the domain had given him something the trap hadn't accounted for. 5 hours in a house that the deepest layer of his neural architecture recognized as home. With a family the construct had built correctly enough that the difference between the simulation and the real thing was a philosophical distinction rather than an experiential one. He was going to have to leave it. He was going to have to walk out of this house and go back to the real. And the real did not contain this house or these people, and would not contain them. And the 11 minutes of quiet were partly the Didact not speaking, and partly John not moving, because moving meant the leaving, and the leaving was, he filed this. "You're trying to figure out how to go," his mother said. "Yes," John said. "That's new," she said. "You didn't know how to come back, and now you don't know how to go. An hour ago, you only had one problem." "It's the same problem," John said, "in both directions." She looked at him. "Is it?" He thought about this. "No," he said. "Coming back requires knowing how to be someone who has a family. Going requires knowing how to carry one." He paused. "Those aren't the same." "Which is harder?" she said. He thought about 30 years of carrying things. The Spartans who hadn't survived. The missions that had cost what missions cost. The specific weight of being the last one standing at the end of every engagement and continuing to operate anyway because the mission didn't pause for what it cost. "Carrying," he said. "I know how to carry. I've been carrying things for 30 years. He looked at her. "The question is whether I'm willing to add this." "Are you?" she said. "Yes," he said. The Didact's presence shifted in the corner. John tracked it, not the combat tracking, the conversation tracking, the attention he gave to a party in a negotiation when they moved unexpectedly. The presence was reorganizing, not the preparation for a pulse or an architecture shift. Something internal, the equivalent of a person in a room adjusting their position when a conversation took a direction they hadn't anticipated. "Something changed," John said, to the corner. Yes, the Didact said. "What?" John said. "Your answer?" the Didact said. "I expected resistance or acceptance. The two available responses to the question of whether you would carry this." A pause. "You gave neither. You assessed whether you were willing and then answered yes, as if willingness were a variable you had control over." Another pause. "I have not thought about willingness as a controllable variable in a long time." "It is," John said. For you it is, the Didact said. You were trained to direct will, to choose what you committed to, and commit completely. The program built that take a thing and decide to carry it, and then carry it without qualification. A pause. I lost the ability to direct will when the Forerunner civilization fell. After that, will direct me. The next threat, the next manufacturer, the next wrong decision, I didn't choose those. They ran through me the way the installation ran through Eridan. You said you couldn't stop it alone, John said. Yes. And now, John said, the domain was quiet. Now I have been in a room for 5 hours with a person who assessed his willingness and answered yes, the Didact said, which is a variable I haven't had access to. Another pause. I don't know what to do with it yet. Neither do I, John said. That seems to be a theme today. David stood up from the chair against the wall. The signal was still gone. John had been monitoring since the Didact released it, and it hadn't returned. The domain's architecture leaving David's body to him without reinserting the override. He stood up and crossed to the window and looked out at the domain's substrate where Eridanus II Street had been and was quiet for a moment. I want to ask you something, he said. Not as the Didact's construct, as myself. Go ahead, John said. David looked at the domain's cold blue, where the neighborhood should have been. When you go back, he said, what are you going to do differently? John considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I'm going to look for the files, he said, the declassified conscription records, the full list of what was taken from which families and where those families are. He paused. I'm going to find out if Thomas and Mary are alive, the real ones. He paused again. And if they are, I'm going to figure out how to make contact. He looked at David. I don't know how. I told you that. I still don't know how. He paused. But I'm going to try. David looked at him. That's all I wanted, he said. 30 years. That's the whole thing. I know, John said. I'm sorry it took this long. You were busy, David said. That's not. I know it's not an excuse, David said. I'm not offering it as one. I'm acknowledging the reality. He turned from the window. You were busy. The war was real. The threats were real. And you still should have found a way, and you didn't. And both of those things are true simultaneously. He looked at John. You say that a lot. Both things being true. It's accurate a lot, John said. David almost smiled. It was John's almost smile, the same suppressed quality, the same reluctance to let it fully develop. The genetic architecture expresses itself in the same social habit across 2 different lives. John saw it and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a tactical category for. You do that, he said. What? David said. Almost smile, John said. I do that. David looked at him for a moment. I know, he said. I've seen footage of you. The domain pulsed. Not hard, not the spike of an architecture shift or the cold blue brightening of a combat sequence initiating. A slow pulse, the substrate's frequency rising and falling once. The quality of a system reaching the end of a process and registering completion. The house began to thin, not dramatically. The walls losing their residential detail. The specific texture of Eridanus II colonial plaster going flat. The furniture's individual character softening toward the generic. The garden's particular plant arrangement simplifying, not dissolution, reduction. The construct conserved resolution as the domain drew back the resources it had committed to the simulation's high detail maintenance. Ending. The domain is releasing the construct, the Didact said. The architecture requires significant substrate resources to maintain biological simulation at this resolution. Without the trap's active purpose, the resources are being reallocated. How long? John said. Minutes, the Didact said. The broad strokes will hold the longest. The details go first. John looked at his family. His mother in her chair, the chair still precise. The woman in it still precise. The resolution held because the domain's deepest records were the most persistent. His father at the room's edge, the grief and the pride in his expression still fully rendered. David by the window, John's face marked by 30 years of a life John hadn't lived, still clear, still specific. He had minutes. He looked at his mother. She was looking at him with the expression she'd worn since the doorway. The difficult thing held steadily, the grief and the love running simultaneously, both present, neither canceling the other. "I know you're not her," he said. "I've known since the beginning." "Yes," she said, "but what you said was real," he said. "The domain built you from what I carried, and what I carried is what was true. So what you said was—" He stopped. "It was accurate." "Yes," she said. "She would have said the same things," he said. "The real her, if I'd found a way back." "I think so," she said. "I can't know, but I think so." John nodded. He looked at his father. Thomas met his eyes and said nothing, and John understood that nothing was the right response, that some things were in the expression, and the expression was sufficient, and adding words would dilute rather than clarify. The pride and the grief and the 30 years held in a look across a room that was thinning at its edges. John held it. Then he looked at David. "You're the one thing she didn't build from records," John said. "The Didact constructed you from my own material. You're what I might have been." "Yes," David said. "The argument you made," John said, "about what I do when the weapon is done with its function, about choosing the mission over the house." He paused. "That argument came from me. The Didact built it from my own material, which means some part of me has been making that argument for a long time." David looked at him. "Yes," he said. "I just needed someone else to say it out loud," John said. "Yes," David said. "The me that was never taken from this house," John said. "He's been in there with everything else, the creek and the garden and the dark rooms. He's been in there making the argument, and I haven't been listening because the program's architecture was too loud." He paused. "Thank you for saying it loud enough." David looked at him for a long moment. "Go find them," he said. "The real ones. Whatever it takes to figure out how. Figure it out." I will," John said. The room's resolution dropped another level. The walls now bear stone, not Eridanus II colonial plaster. The domain's underlying substrate visible, geometric, and cold, and honest about what it was. The furniture has abstract shapes. The details are gone. But his family still rendered the three of them still fully present. The domain holding the people at maximum resolution, while everything else reduced. The construct's priority hierarchy, expressing what the domain had been built to understand about what mattered in any given space. The people last. Always the people last. His mother stood. She crossed the thinning room and stood in front of him again. The hand on his face again, the right temperature, the right pressure, the neural architecture's deepest record holding steady even as the walls went flat around it. "John," she said. "I know," he said. "Say it anyway," she said. He looked at her, at the face built from the deepest layer of what he'd carried for 30 years, at the love in it that the domain had reconstructed from his own neural architecture because his own neural architecture had stored it correctly, had stored it first, before anything else. "I'm John," he said, "and I'm still here." She held his eyes. "Yes," she said, "you are." She stepped back. The room reduced to its final state, the domain substrate, 4 walls and a floor and a cold blue light, and 3 shapes where his family stood. The resolution gone, but the presence held. The construct's last resources committed to keeping them present until the end. "The exit is behind you," the Didact said. John didn't turn. "Not yet." "The Prometheans," he said. To the Didact's presence in the corner that was now just the corner, the flat geometry of the domain's architecture without the house's angles around it, the ones you composed, their consciousnesses in the domain, and May. "Yes," the Didact said. "They're still there, John said. Yes, and you have access to them, John said. In the domain's substrate. Yes, the Didact said. Where are you going with this? You said you couldn't stop alone, John said. You need a variable, something external, to interrupt the sequence of wrong decisions. He paused. The Prometheans were your warriors, people who fought beside you before you composed them, people who might have had an opinion about what you did and what you should do instead. He looked at the corner. You've been alone in the domain for 10,000 years with their consciousnesses, and you haven't talked to them. The domain was very quiet. No, the Didact said. Why? John said. Because they would have the same opinion your brother had, the Didact said, about consent, about what was done to them without asking, about the decision I made for them. A long pause. I have not talked to them because I don't know how to sit in the room with what they would say. John looked at the three shapes that were his family, at what it had cost to sit in this room, at what had been on the other side of the cost. Learn, he said, to the Didact, the same way I'm learning. It's not clean, and it's not fast, and it doesn't resolve anything on a useful timeline. He paused. But it's real. And the real things are the only ones that actually change anything. The domain held this. That, the Didact said, may be the most useful thing anyone has said to me in 10,000 years. It's not wisdom, John said. I'm figuring it out as I say it. Most wisdom is, the Didact said. John turned toward the exit. The exit was a door. Not a forerunner, construct a residential door, wood-framed, the specific hardware of Eridanus II colonial architecture. The same door John had walked through at 6 years old on the morning Halsey's team came. The domain had built the exit from the same source material as everything else, pulling the departure point from the deepest available record of what leaving this house had looked like. He stood in front of it. Behind him, the construct's final resolution held the three shapes, his family's presence without their detail, the domain committing its last resources to keeping them in the room until he chose to go. He could feel them there, the way he could feel a position being held by people he trusted, the specific quality of a rear guard. He didn't turn around again. Before you go, the Didact said. John waited. The simulation extracted something from you, the Didact said. Not deliberately. The domain's architecture records everything that passes through it. The conversation, the combat data, the neural responses to the construct's stimuli. A pause. What you said in this room about consent, about Halsey, about both things being true simultaneously, it's in the domain substrate now. I know, John said. I want you to understand what that means, the Didact said. The domain is not a private space. What enters it persists. The Forerunner installed it as a repository of all knowledge and experience. Every consciousness that has passed through it has left something behind. Another pause. Look, what you said about willingness being a controllable variable, about the answer existing even when you don't have it yet, those are in the domain now. End quote. Alongside 10,000 years of wrong decisions, John said. Yes, the Didact said, but also alongside everything the Forerunner civilization learned before it destroyed itself. Every piece of knowledge and wisdom and failure that a civilization spanning the galaxy accumulated across 100,000 years. A pause. The domain is a large space. Your conversation doesn't get lost in it. It gets contextualized, John said. Yes, the Didact said, into something that has more context than any single consciousness can hold. Another pause. I am telling you this because you should know that what happened in this room didn't only happen for you. It happened for the domain. A longer pause. And through the domain for everything the domain touches. John processed this. The Promethean consciousnesses, he said. They heard everything, the Didact said. Yes. And, John said, the domain shifted. Not the pulse of an architecture change, or the cold blue spike of a combat sequence. Something different, the specific quality of a space that had been holding something back and had stopped holding it. Like pressure releasing, like a door opening somewhere in the substrate that had been sealed for a very long time. Voices. Not loud, the domains register, the way sound existed in a substrate rather than a physical space, the resonance of consciousnesses that existed as information rather than biology. More than one. More than 10. The specific quality of people who had heard something and were responding to it and had been waiting, John understood, for the conversation that had just happened to give them the framework to respond. The Prometheans. They've been listening, John said. Since you arrived, the Didact said. The presence in the corner had changed quality. The military architecture still present, but something else running underneath it. The specific frequency of something that had been alone for a very long time and had just become less alone. They've been in the domain substrate since the composition. They've heard everything that has passed through it. They heard your conversation. What do they want? John said. The same thing your brother wanted, the Didact said. Someone to say out loud that what was done to them was wrong. A pause. And the same thing you said you'd give the real Thomas and Mary? Contact. An attempt. Another pause. They want the Didact to sit in the room. Ask. John looked at the door. At the exit built from the neural record of leaving this house at 6 years old. Are you going to? He said. A very long pause. I don't know how, the Didact said. John turned around. The three shapes of his family were still in the room, the construct's resolution gone, but the presence held, the domain keeping them at the edge of what it could maintain. He looked at the corner where the Didact's presence held its position. You built this whole trap, he said, from something I didn't know how to do. You built a house from my neural architecture and put my family in it and ran the whole construct because I didn't know how to come back to this house and you wanted to see what I'd do without knowing. He looked at the corner steadily. I sat down at the table. That's what I did. I sat down at the table and I talked to my father. The domain held this. Sit down at the table, John said, with the Prometheans, with what they want to say. You don't have to know how before you start. You start and they know how to start. He paused. That's what the room gave me. That's what I can give you. You're telling me the method, the Didact said. I'm telling you the only method available, John said, because it's the one that works. It's the one that worked here, and it's the one that will work with them. He looked at the corner. You said willingness was the variable you didn't have access to. You have it now. You just have to use it. The corner was quiet for a long time. Then the domain shifted again, the pressure release quality. Deeper this time, the substrate reorganizing at a level below the surface. The Forerunner architecture's deep systems respond to a decision being made in the consciousness that runs the domain's active processes. The Didact was preparing to sit down at the table. Go, the Didact said. While I can maintain the exit architecture, the construct's resources are nearly exhausted. John looked at his family shapes one more time. The real ones, he said, not to the Didact, to the shapes. I'll find the real ones. The shapes held their position. He turned back to the door. He opened it. The transition was not what he expected. He had expected the domain's cold blue giving way to whatever the real world looked like from inside the simulation, the sharp edge of one reality replacing another, the specific disorientation of a consciousness returning to its primary substrate. Combat insertions from slip space had that quality. The composer's extraction had that quality in the reports he'd read. This was different. The door opened onto gray. Not the gray of an unrendered space, the specific gray of a morning that hadn't decided what weather to be. Highland terrain. Reaches colonial atmosphere at low altitude, the ground cover wet from an earlier rainfall, the mountains visible at their correct bearing. He was back on Reach, the simulation's entry point. The Covenant soldiers were not present. The landscape was exactly what Reach's landscape was before the Covenant came, before the glassing, before the end of everything the UNSC had built on that planet. Empty highland terrain under an undecided sky, the air cold and clean, and carrying the specific quality of a place that was still itself. Mjolnir was on him. He registered it section by section, the seals, the pressure differential, the HUD running its standard feed in the lower portion of his vision, the suit intact, fully powered, every system nominal. The simulation had returned it cleanly. Cortana. He reached for the neural interface. Present. Not the silence of the domain's absent architecture, the specific presence of a consciousness he'd been missing for the duration. The warm frequency signal of an AI whose rampancy arc was still ahead of her and who was currently in the process of being very alert. "Chief," she said. "I'm here," he said. "You've been in a domain construct for 5 hours, 14 minutes, she said. The voice carrying the specific quality she used when she was processing something significant and choosing how much of the processing to show. The Didact initiated it. "I couldn't reach you." A pause. "Are you all right?" He thought about how to answer this accurately. "Yes," he said. "And no," both simultaneously. A pause from Cortana. "That's new," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you want to talk about it?" she said. He looked at Reach's empty highland terrain, on a gray morning, at the mountains, at their correct bearing, under an undecided sky. "Not yet," he said. "I need to process it first." "All right," she said. He started walking. "Chief," Cortana said. "Yes." "What did he want?" she said. "The Didact. What was the trap for?" John looked at the mountains. "He wanted to know if I was still in here," he said. A pause. "And I am," he said. Another pause longer, the quality of someone receiving information they'd been carrying the weight of not having and were now setting down. Cortana didn't say anything for 11 seconds, and John let her not say anything, because the not saying was itself communication, and he had gotten better in the last 5 hours at listening to what people weren't saying. "Good," she said finally. "Yes," he said, "it is." He walked through Reach's empty highland terrain, and the morning held its gray, and the mountains held their bearing, and the suit held its seal, and Cortana held her frequency in the neural interface, and John 117 held. Everything else, the garden, and the creek, and the dark rooms, and his mother's hand at the right temperature, and his father's expression that didn't need words, and his brother's almost smile, and the question that didn't have an answer yet, and the knowledge that the answer existed and was findable. He held it the way he held everything, completely, without qualification. "Cortana," he said. "Yes." "When we get back," he said, "I need you to help me find something." "What?" she said. "Records," he said. "Eridanus II. Conscription files. Family registries from the SPARTAN-II program's intake period." The neural interface was quiet for a moment. "Chief," she said. "Yes." "You know I've already found them," she said. "I've had them for 2 years. I've been waiting for you to ask." John stopped walking. He stood in the middle of Reach's highland terrain under the gray morning sky and processed this Cortana, carrying the files, for 2 years, waiting for the question, knowing what the question would mean when he was ready to ask it. The specific patience of an intelligence that understood its person better than its person understood itself, and had the discipline to wait for the right moment rather than forcing the information before it could land. 2 years, he said. "You weren't ready," she said. "You are now." He looked at the mountains. "Yes," he said. "I am." He started walking again. The morning held its gray, and the terrain held its bearing, and somewhere in the domain's substrate, a military consciousness that had been alone for 10,000 years was sitting down at a table for the first time, and the Promethean consciousnesses that had been waiting since the composition were on the other side of it, and the conversation that needed to happen was beginning. And on Eridanus II, in a colony that was still standing because the war had ended and the threats had been managed, and the galaxy was slowly becoming something that didn't require extinction-level responses to every given year. Two people who had been looking at UNSC footage for 30 years were alive. John knew this now. He carried it the way he carried everything. He kept moving. The debrief was in a room that smelled like recycled air and institutional coffee. John had been in hundreds of rooms that smelled like this. The specific combination of UNSC facilities across 30 years of operations. The environmental systems that processed the same air on a loop, and the coffee that nobody made well because nobody had time to make it well. The smell was so familiar it was almost a calibration point, the olfactory equivalent of a horizon line. You knew where you were when you smelled it. He sat across the table from Admiral Parangoski. She was in her 80s and had been running ONI since before John's conscription, and had the specific quality of someone who had spent 40 years making decisions that nobody else was willing to make and had made peace with what that cost. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, the flat assessment of someone for whom most surprises had already happened, and new information was simply more data to file. Beside her was a younger officer whose name John had been given and hadn't retained, which was his standard processing for administrative personnel in debrief contexts. Cortana was in the room's interface system, not projecting, present in the architecture, running her own assessment of the debrief's parameters alongside John's. 5 hours 14 minutes in a domain construct, Parangoski said. The Didact initiated it during a standard patrol insertion on the Reach Memorial site. She looked at the debrief record on the table's surface. Your vitals remained stable throughout. Neural activity consistent with REM-level immersive simulation. You showed no sign of the composer's extraction process. She looked up. What did he want? Information, John said. What kind? Whether I still existed as a person underneath the program's architecture, John said. Parangoski looked at him. He wanted to know if the SPARTAN-II program had fully replaced the individual, John said. Whether John 117 the person was still running underneath Master Chief the weapon. And, Parangoski said. He got his answer, John said. What was the answer? She said. Yes, John said. The person is still running. Parangoski was quiet for a moment. The flat assessment running. The 40 years of ONI operational experience evaluating what a returning operative looked like after 5 hours in a Forerunner construct, what the calls were for compromise, for contamination, for the specific alterations in behavior that indicated something had been inserted rather than extracted. She was reading him. He let her read. You're different, she said. Yes, he said. Different how? She said. John thought about how to answer this in a way that was accurate and useful and didn't produce an ONI psychological evaluation that took him offline for 6 weeks. I have a question, he said. That's not an answer, Parangoski said. The question is the answer, he said. I came out of the domain with a question I didn't have going in. That's the difference. What question? She said. John looked at her. He thought about Parangoski's specific position in the architecture of what had been done to him. She hadn't been the one who made the decision. Halsey had made the decision, and the admirals above Halsey had authorized the program, and the institutional logic of a civilization facing extinction had provided the framework. Parangoski had inherited the program the way all institutions inherited their predecessors' decisions. She had also run ONI for 40 years and understood exactly what the program had done and had never seen any reason to address it. The conscription records, John said. The SPARTAN-II program's family intake documentation. Parangoski's expression didn't change. The families of the conscripted children, John said. Their current status, location, whether they're alive. That information is classified, the younger officer said. John looked at him. The younger officer processed the look and stopped talking. Why? Parangoski said. Not to the officer, to John. Because the Didact built a simulation from my family and put me in it for 5 hours, John said. And the simulation was built correctly enough that the difference between it and the real thing was a philosophical distinction. And I sat in it, and I talked to my parents, and my he stopped. I talked to my parents, and I understood some things that I hadn't understood before. He looked at Parangoski. And I want to find the real ones. The debrief room held this. The younger officer was very still. Parangoski looked at John for a long time. You understand what you're asking, she said, not objecting, verifying. Yes, John said. The families were told their children died, she said. Flash clone replacements that lived weeks to months. The bereavement was documented, managed, and filed. Unquote. End quote. The families were monitored for years afterward for any indication they'd identified the substitution. She paused. If we provide you with the locations of those families and you make contact, the program becomes real to them again, John said. What was done to them becomes specific and present rather than a historical event. He paused. I know. And you want to do it anyway, Parangoski said. I want to try, John said. Not all of them. Mine, my specific family. He paused. I want Oni to authorize the contact, formally. With support from the institutional side, a prepared briefing, a counseling resource, whatever the process should look like. He paused again. I don't want to show up on a doorstep with no framework. I want to do it correctly. Correctly, Parangoski said. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long time. The Didact did this, she said. Yes, John said. He put you in a simulation of your family home and had your parents tell you what the program took from them, she said. And now you want Onai to help you repair a 30-year damage that Onai caused. She paused. He's a very sophisticated operator. Yes, John said. He is. And you don't think this is contamination, she said. He sends you back wanting things from Onai that Onai doesn't normally provide. That doesn't concern you. John thought about this carefully. He wanted to know if the person was still running, he said. He found out the person was still running, and the person wants to find his family. End quote. He looked at Parangoski. That's not contamination. That's what the person has always wanted. The Didact just created conditions where I couldn't keep filing it. Parangoski looked at the debrief record. She looked at John. She looked at Cortana's presence in the room's interface architecture, a look that acknowledged what she was doing, that she knew Cortana was there and was including her in the communication. Cortana, she said. Admiral, Cortana said. Do you have the records he's asking about? Parangoski said. A pause. Yes. How long? Parangoski said. 2 years, Cortana said. Parangoski looked at John. Your AI has been carrying the files for 2 years, she said. Yes, John said. Waiting for you to ask, she said. Yes, John said. Something moved across Parangoski's expression, not the flat assessment, something underneath it. The specific quality of a person who had spent 40 years making hard decisions suddenly in the presence of something that wasn't a hard decision, something simple. A person who wanted to find his family and the means to do it, and the only obstacle being institutional habit rather than genuine necessity. I'll authorize the contact protocol, she said. Standard sensitive re-engagement procedure. Counseling support, prepared briefing, intermediary first contact before direct engagement. She paused. It will take 3 weeks to prepare correctly. That's acceptable, John said. And the classified status of the family location data, she said. I'm going to need to document a justification for the reclassification. 30 years seems like enough, John said. Parangoski looked at him. Yes, she said. I think it does. The debrief ended at the 2-hour mark. John walked the facility's corridors toward the exit. The recycled air and the institutional coffee smell extending through every section. The UNSC's environmental systems indifferent to the specific nature of whatever had just happened in the debrief room. The facility functioned, the air cycled, the coffee was bad. Cortana was in his neural interface. 3 weeks, she said. Yes, he said. "What do you want to do in the meantime?" she said. He thought about this. "The mission," he said. "There's always a mission." Parangoski briefed the next insertion on my way in the Forerunner site on Caro, the domain activity that's been flagging for 6 weeks. He paused. "I'll run the insertion." "And after the insertion," Cortana said. "And after the insertion, the 3 weeks will be closer to finished," he said. "And after that," she said. He thought about a door built from the neural record of leaving a house at 6 years old, about the gray morning on Reach's highland terrain and the mountains at their correct bearing, about what he was carrying now that he hadn't been carrying before. "After that, I'll learn how," he said. "The same way I said I would." Cortana was quiet for a moment. "In the domain," she said. "When you were in there, were you?" She stopped. Started again. "Were you all right?" "During, not after." A pause. "I couldn't reach you, and the vitals were stable, and I knew you were stable, but I couldn't reach you." John understood what she was asking. "No," he said, "not during." He paused. But the "not all right" was the point. The Didact built the trap around the specific things that were hard. If it had been all right, it wouldn't have done what it needed to do. He paused again. "I was not all right, and I got through it, and what's on the other side is worth what it cost." "That's a very Spartan way to describe grief," Cortana said. "Yes," he said, "it is." He paused. "I'm working on having other ways." Cortana was quiet for 2 seconds. "I know," she said. "I've watched you work on things for 15 years. You're thorough." "Yes," he said. "You'll get there," she said. He walked the corridors, and the air recycled, and somewhere in the domain's substrate a conversation was beginning that had been 30 years overdue in one direction, and 10,000 years overdue in another. And on Eridanus II, too. People who had buried a child that wasn't their child were alive, and in 3 weeks, John would know how to reach them. Not how to be the person who walked through the door. Not yet. But how to reach them. The rest he would learn from the start. 3 weeks later, John stood outside a house on Eridanus II. Single story, colonial architecture. A garden that someone had maintained with care, not the same plants as the domain simulation, the 30 years having changed what was planted there, but the same layout. The same beds, in the same positions. The same gate at the front. The specific hardware of the original construction. Unchanged. He stood on the street outside it. He had been standing there for 6 minutes. The Oni intermediary had made first contact 11 days ago. The prepared briefing had been delivered in person, with the counseling resource present, in the specific format that Parangoski's team had developed for sensitive re-engagement. His mother had listened to the entire briefing without saying anything. His father had asked 3 questions, specific, precise, the questions of a man who had spent 30 years thinking about this moment and had organized the questions he needed answered. The intermediary had reported both of them as stable, ready, wanting. John had read the report 4 times. He had run the Caro insertion in the intervening weeks, and it had gone correctly, and he had filed it and continued, and the mission had been the mission, and he had carried everything else alongside it the way he carried everything, completely, without qualification. 3 weeks had passed. He was here. He had been standing outside the gate for 6 minutes, and the tactical processor was doing nothing useful, and Mjolnir was in storage on the Oni transport 4 streets away because showing up in full Spartan armor at his parents' front door was not the correct approach, and he had known this and left the suit behind and was now standing in a UNSC dress uniform on a residential street on Eridanus II, feeling the specific exposure of a man without his armor in a context. That wasn't combat, Chief, Cortana said. She was in a portable interface unit, a small device, civilian grade, the kind that existed for personal AI use rather than battlefield application. He had carried it in his left hand for the walk from the transport. She had been quiet since they left the transport, which was her version of giving him space while remaining present. "Yes," he said. "6 minutes," she said. "I know," he said. "The door hasn't opened," she said. "They don't know you're here yet. The intermediary said to arrive at 1400, and it's 1402. They're inside, waiting." "I know," he said. "What are you doing?" she said. He thought about this. "Looking at the garden," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "It's a good garden," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." He looked at the gate, at the garden behind it, at the path from the gate to the front door, the specific distance he had walked every morning at 5 years old, on his way to pull weeds. He thought about the domain's version of this, the simulation's house, the construct's garden, the cold blue light the domain had used to replace Eridanus II's warm G-type spectrum. The way the domain had gotten the weight distribution right, the way his mother had stood in the doorway with the weight slightly on the left foot. He thought about what she had said in the construct's thinning room. "Knowing you're here isn't a weakness. It's the thing it can't break." He put his hand on the gate. The hardware was the same as the domain's version, the specific latch mechanism of Eridanus II colonial construction, the particular resistance of a gate that had been opened and closed 10,000 times and had developed the specific behavior of well-used hardware. The domain had gotten this right too. He opened it. He walked up the path. He knocked on the door. His mother answered it. The weight slightly on the left foot. The hair is red-brown, the same shade as the simulation's version, the specific color that caught light differently depending on angle. Older than the domain's reconstruction by 30 years, the lines around her eyes, the gray at her temples, the specific marking of a life lived through things that were hard and had continued living. She looked at him. He was 2 meters and 12 centimeters in a dress uniform, and she was looking up at him the way she had looked up at the construct's version of herself in the domain, the height differential unchanged, the specific geometry of a mother looking at a child who had become something large. She didn't say anything for a long time. He let her not say anything. "You look like your father," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at his face. At the specific features that Thomas's genetics had produced in the male line, and that Halsey's program had built upon, and that 30 years of war had marked in ways the program hadn't predicted. She looked at all of it and held it. "Come inside," she said. "Yes," he said. He stepped through the door. The house's interior was different from the simulation. Not entirely, the layout was the same. The kitchen to the left, the sitting room ahead, the hallway to the bedrooms. The bones of the house were the domain's bones. But the 30 years had changed the surface of everything. Different furniture accumulated differently. The specific collection of a family that had continued, had added to itself, had replaced things that wore out and kept things that mattered. Different smell. Partially, the olfactory record he carried from 6 years old was still in here somewhere, but 30 years of different life had layered over it, the smell of a house that had continued to be lived in. His father was in the sitting room, standing. Not in the chair by the window standing at the room's center, the posture of someone who had been sitting and had stood when they heard the door and hadn't decided where to be since. He looked at John from across the room. The grief was there, the same grief as the domain's version, the specific marking of 30 years of a loss that had no resolution. But underneath it, something the simulation hadn't had the 30 years to produce. Not just pride. Something that had been waiting longer than pride and was more specific. Relief. The specific relief of a thing that had been unresolved for so long, it had become structural, finally resolving. "Thomas," John said. Not the word he had used in the simulation, his father's name. "John," his father said. They stood across the room from each other. John crossed it. He had not planned this. The tactical processor had not generated this as a sequence. The program had not produced a protocol for it. It came from somewhere underneath the program, the layer his mother had named correctly in the construct, the one that the domain had confirmed was still running. He crossed the room and his father's arms came up, and the height differential was enormous, and none of that mattered. His father held on. John stood in the sitting room of his parents' house on Eridanus II, in a dress uniform without his armor, and his father held on, and he let himself be held, and the 6-year-old boy who had left this house in the early morning, hours of a day he remembered in fragments, was briefly, specifically, completely present, both of them at once. The boy and the Spartan. Both things are true simultaneously. They sat for 4 hours. Not the structured conversation of the domain's simulation. The Didact's construct had organized the exchange, had built it toward specific revelations, had managed the emotional temperature with the precision of something that had designed the experience for a purpose. This was different, unmanaged. The specific texture of people who had too much to say and not enough time, and were learning in real time what order to say it in. His mother made food. He ate it. The first meal in his parents' house in 31 years, in the actual house with the actual people. And it was ordinary food, and he ate it, and she watched him eat it with the expression of someone doing something they had imagined doing for a very long time. His father asked the 3 questions the intermediary had reported. John answered them without the institutional framing, not the mission answer or the tactical answer, but the actual answer, which in each case was longer and less clean and more true. His father listened to each one completely before asking the next. The patience of a man who had learned to wait. His mother asked different questions. Smaller ones. The ones that lived in the details of a life she hadn't been present for. What he ate on long deployments. Whether he slept. What Cortana was like, she had been briefed on Cortana. The Oni intermediary had covered the AI, and his mother had the specific curiosity of someone who had understood from the briefing that her son had not been alone. "She sounds like someone I'd like," his mother said. John looked at the portable interface unit on the table beside him. Cortana's light was steady. She'd been present throughout, quiet, running her own assessment of the conversation's parameters and staying out of it. "Cortana," he said. "Mary," Cortana said through the unit speaker. His mother looked at the device. "He talks about you," Cortana said. "Not in words, in the way he moves through difficult things." A pause. "He carries you. He's been carrying you the whole time." His mother looked at the device for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, "for being with him. Thank you for making him someone worth being with," Cortana said. His mother looked at John. He looked at his mother. Both of them had nothing to say, because some things were in the expression, and the expression was sufficient. At the 4-hour mark, his father walked him to the garden. The evening was coming in Eridanus II's G-type star, at a low angle. The warm spectrum the domain had replaced with cold blue, now doing what it actually did at this hour. The long shadows of late afternoon across the beds his mother maintained. They stood in the garden. "I want to ask you something," his father said. "Not from the list." He paused. "A different kind of question." "Go ahead," John said. "Are you all right?" Thomas said. "Not the mission, not the program. You." He looked at his son. "Are you all right?" John stood in his parents' garden in the late afternoon light of Eridanus II and thought about the domain's cold blue and Reach's gray morning, and the Didact's presence in the wrong-angled corner, and David's almost smile. That was his almost smile. And his mother's hand at the right temperature. He thought about what he was carrying. He thought about what he had learned to reach. He thought about a conversation beginning in the domain substrate between a military consciousness that had been alone for 10,000 years and the warriors it had wronged, and what it meant that the conversation was real and was happening. He thought about standing outside this gate for 6 minutes looking at the garden. He thought about crossing the sitting room. He thought about the answer existing even when he didn't have it yet, and the method being the starting, and the knowing how coming from the starting, and everything his mother had named and his brother had asked, and the Didact had heard, and Cortana had carried for 2 years, waiting for the question. He thought about both things being true simultaneously. "No," he said, "not entirely." His father looked at him. "But more than I was this morning. he said. And more than I was 3 weeks ago. And more than I was before the domain. He paused. It's not a clean answer. No, his father said. It's not. It's the accurate one, John said. Thomas looked at his son for a long time. Come back, he said. When the next mission is done, come back. I don't know how yet, John said. I told you, I'm learning. I know, his father said. Come back anyway. You'll be further along by then. John looked at the garden, at the beds in their positions, at the specific layout he had memorized at 5 years old, and that the domain had reproduced correctly, and that was still here in the actual world, exactly where it had always been. Yes, he said, I will. He walked back to the Oni transport alone. The streets of the colony at evening residential, ordinary. The specific texture of a place that had been stable long enough to develop the unhurried quality of somewhere that had survived things and continued. People on the streets, children on the streets. The ordinary movement of a population that didn't know a Spartan was walking through it and wouldn't have known what to do with the information if they did. He walked through it, and it was real, and he was in it. Cortana was in the interface unit in his left hand. How do you feel? She said. He thought about this for the length of a block. Like, I'm figuring out how, he said. That's good, she said. Yes, he said. It is. The Caro follow-up insertion is in 6 days, she said. Parangoski's briefing is the day after tomorrow. I know, he said. And the domain activity on the site is still flagging, she said. The analysts think the Didact's substrate presence has shifted. The frequency is different from pre-trap readings, changed somehow. Yes, John said. It would be. You know what changed it, she said. Yes, he said. Are you going to tell me? She said. He thought about a military consciousness sitting down at a table with the people it had wronged after 10,000 years of not being able to, about what it meant to start without knowing how, and learn the knowing how from the starting. He's having a conversation he should have had a long time ago, John said. That's what changed the frequency. Someone is finally sitting in the room. Cortana was quiet for a moment. The Prometheans, she said. Yes, he said. You told him to, she said. I told him the method, he said. He chose to use it. She processed this for 2 blocks. Chief, she said. Yes. What you said in the domain, she said. About willingness being a controllable variable. About the answer existing even when you don't have it yet. She paused. I've been thinking about that. And, he said. And I think it applies to more than what you were talking about, she said. I think it applies to, she stopped. There are things I'm afraid of, that I've been afraid of, for a long time. That I've been carrying the same way you were carrying the family question. Another pause. The rampancy projections. What I become. Whether I'm still me at the end of it. John stopped walking. He stood on the street in the evening light of Eridanus II and looked at the interface unit in his hand. Cortana, he said. I'm not asking you to fix it, she said. I'm not asking for the tactical answer or the mission answer. I'm just, she stopped. I wanted to say it out loud. In the room, the way you said things today. A pause. The answer exists, even when I don't have it. That's what you said. Yes, he said. I wanted to believe that, she said. About this. I've been carrying it and not believing that. And today, she paused. Today you came back from the domain and you said it, and I've been thinking about it since. John looked at the interface unit. At the steady light of a consciousness he had been with for 15 years, that had carried his family's files for 2 years, waiting for him to ask, that had known before he did what the domain had done for him, and had said good in the specific tone of someone setting something down. The answer exists, he said, for this too, for what you're afraid of. He paused. I don't have it yet. You don't have it yet. It's there. You don't know that, she said. No, he said. I believe it. There's a difference. He paused. I learned the difference today. Cortana was quiet for a long time. Sit in the room, she said. Yes, he said. With me, she said. I'm already here, he said. The interface unit's light held steady. He started walking again. The colony's evening moved around him, the ordinary texture of a place that had survived things, the unhurried quality of somewhere still itself, the children on the streets and the people on the streets, and the long shadows of a G-type star doing what it did at this hour. He walked through it, both things true simultaneously, the weapon and the person, the mission and the garden, the boy who had pulled weeds at 5 years old, and the Spartan who had carried him for 30 years without knowing he was there. All of it. He carried it. All of it. He kept moving, in the domain substrate, at a frequency that the UNSC's monitoring systems flagged as anomalous and did not understand. A conversation was running. It had been running for 3 weeks. It would run for a long time. The Didact had not manufactured a new threat. Not yet. The Prometheans were talking. He was listening. That was enough. For now, that was enough. And that's where we leave him. Not on a battlefield. Not in Mjolnir. Not standing over a defeated enemy, with the mission complete and the next one already loading. We leave John 117 on a residential street on Eridanus II in the evening light, walking back to a transport with a portable AI unit in his hand, carrying something new alongside everything else he carries. The knowledge that he exists. That's what the Didact's trap produced. Not a broken Spartan. Not a psychological crisis that ends the program. Not the weapon failing when the weapon was needed. The trap produced the one thing the Didact actually wanted confirmation. That underneath 30 years of institutional formation and augmentation and war, the 6-year-old boy from that house was still running. Still there. Still John. And here's what makes this the most unsettling thing the Didact has ever done. Not the composers, not the Prometheans, not the Halo array itself. He didn't attack the Master Chief. He helped him. He built a trap that forced John 117 to sit in a room with the thing he'd been filing and avoiding for 30 years. And he ran that trap not to break the weapon, but to answer a question he'd been carrying since he watched the Forerunner civilization destroy itself. Whether the answer existed, whether a person could be made into a weapon and still find their way back to being a person. He needed to know, because he is the case study for what happens when the answer is no. 10,000 years of wrong decisions. The composers, the Prometheans, the manufacture of new threats to justify continued operation. A military consciousness that couldn't stop being what it was built to be because it had been alone in the domain for 10,000 years with nothing to introduce a variable. And then John walks in and says the answer exists even when you don't have it yet. And says the method is starting without knowing how. And says sit down at the table. So the Didact sits down at the table. For the first time in 10,000 years, with the Prometheans he wronged. We don't know what that conversation produces. We don't know what a Forerunner military consciousness looks like on the other side of 10,000 years of wrong decisions being accounted for. We don't know if the Didact becomes something different or whether the accounting is itself the end of something that needed to end. What we know is the conversation is running, and John is on a street on Eridanus II, learning how to be the person who goes back. And Cortana is carrying something she finally said out loud. And on the domain's frequency, the UNSC's monitoring systems are flagging something anomalous that they don't understand. They should pay attention to that. Because the Didact, finding a reason to stop manufacturing threats, is either the best thing that has happened in this galaxy in 10,000 years, or the beginning of something none of us have a category for yet. And John 117, the man, not the weapon, is going to be the variable in either case. He always is. That's what Halsey built. That's what the Didact confirmed. That's what the boy from Eridanus II became. Both things. Simultaneously. All of it true at once. If this story landed for you, if the idea of the Master Chief sitting in his childhood home without his armor answering questions he's been filing for 30 years, hit differently than the standard crossover tell us in BS. The comments. Tell us what you want to see next. What universe should we break open? What character should we strip down to the question underneath the armor? We read everything. We're building the next one already. Subscribe. You know why.